The clink of ice in a glass, the low murmur of 100 conversations weaving into a single, expensive sound. That was the backdrop to my particular brand of anxiety. For 3 nights a week, I wore a starched white shirt and a black bow tie that felt like a polite noose, and I served miniature food to people whose shoes cost more than my rent. It wasn't a bad job, as jobs went. It was anonymous. I was just a pair of hands offering a tray, a quiet presence meant to be overlooked. Most of the time, that was exactly what I wanted. It was a life ordered for safety, for solitude. My small apartment was a fortress of quiet, my routines a series of walls to keep the past from finding me. But some nights, the anonymity wore thin. I would watch a couple laugh, their heads bent close together, and a hollow ache would open up in my chest. It was a familiar ghost, that yearning for a connection I was too scared to seek. My last attempt at a relationship had left me shattered, convinced that I was better off alone. Julian had a way of making love feel like a battlefield, and I was tired of being a casualty. All I had left from that time was a single, saved text message on an old phone I kept in a drawer. It was from the day before everything fell apart, a rare moment of simple affection. I kept it as a reminder that such a thing had, at one point, existed. Tonight was the annual Foundation Gala at the Vance Conservancy, a sprawling modern art museum owned and operated by the Vance Family Trust. The man at the top, Arthur Vance, was a local legend. Older, somewhere in his 50s, with a reputation for being intensely private and devastatingly shrewd. I'd seen pictures of him, of course. Silver at the temples, a face that looked like it had been carved from something strong and enduring, and eyes that seemed to miss nothing. He was the kind of man who moved with a quiet gravity, drawing attention without ever demanding it. And from the shadows of my serving route, I had been quietly, hopelessly, attracted to him for the better part of a year. It was a safe crush, a fantasy about a man so far out of my league he might as well have been on another planet. My tray was nearly empty of its bacon-wrapped dates when a shift in the room's energy snagged my attention. A new arrival was making his way through the crowd, all bright white teeth and easy charm, clapping men on the back and air-kissing women's cheeks. My blood went cold. It was Julian. He wasn't supposed to be here. This was my safe, anonymous space. His presence felt like a violation, a bright, loud poison seeping into my carefully constructed peace. I froze, my hand tightening on the edge of the silver tray. He hadn't seen me yet, but it was only a matter of time. Julian had a sixth sense for my discomfort. He thrived on it. I knew exactly what would happen. He'd spot me, a wide, predatory grin would spread across his face, and he would make a scene. A small one, probably, something just for me. A comment on my uniform, a question about how I was managing since he'd left, all delivered with that charming, cutting tone that made it sound like a compliment to everyone else. Panic, sharp and cold, clawed its way up my throat. I had to get out of his line of sight. I had to disappear. I turned, ready to bolt for the kitchens, but the path was blocked by a thick cluster of guests. I was trapped. Julian's laugh, loud and familiar, echoed from across the room. He was getting closer. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. My gaze darted around, searching for any escape, any shield. And then I saw him, a man standing alone by a tall marble pillar, his back partially to me. He was watching the crowd with a look of detached calm. He wore a perfectly tailored dark suit, the kind that whispered wealth instead of shouting it. His posture was solid, steady, a rock in a churning sea. Without thinking, without planning, driven by pure, animal instinct to hide, I moved toward him. I reached his side in 3 quick steps. My hand was trembling. I didn't say a word. I just reached out and took his arm, my fingers gripping the fine wool of his jacket sleeve. It was a desperate, insane act, grabbing a complete stranger in a room full of millionaires. For a split second, I expected him to shake me off, to call security, to look at me with disgust. Instead, the man turned his head slowly. The first thing I registered were his eyes. They were a cool, clear gray, and they held no alarm. Only a quiet, assessing curiosity. It was him, Arthur Vance, the man from the photographs, the man from my foolish daydreams. He was even more imposing in person, yet his presence felt less like a threat and more like a shelter. He looked down at my pale, tense knuckles clutching his arm, then back up to my face. A flicker of understanding seemed to pass through his expression, and then he did something that completely unmoored me. He lifted his own hand and gently, deliberately, placed it over mine. His touch was warm and firm, a silent anchor. He didn't pull away. He held me there. His gaze shifted past my shoulder, scanning the room. I knew, without having to look, that he had found Julian. A low, calm voice, smoother than I had imagined, reached my ears. "Stay with me," he said. It wasn't a question or a command. It was a quiet instruction, an offer of sanctuary. And in that moment, clinging to the arm of the city's most powerful man to hide from my own pathetic past, all I could do was nod. He kept me by his side, his hand a steady weight over mine. It felt like a strange dream. One moment, I was a panicked server on the verge of a humiliating encounter, and the next I was standing beside Arthur Vance, tucked into his personal space, as if I belonged there. He didn't introduce me, didn't explain my sudden presence. He simply absorbed me into his orbit. Julian was still scanning the room, his eyes sharp and restless, but they passed right over us. It was as if Arthur's stillness created a bubble of invisibility. To Julian, I was no longer a target. I was just someone with the host. After a moment that stretched into an eternity, Arthur leaned in slightly, his voice a low murmur meant only for me. "Is the danger past?" he asked. The scent of him was subtle, clean wool, and something faintly woodsy, like sandalwood. It was grounding. I finally found my voice, though it came out as a weak, reedy thing. "I think so. Yes. Thank you." My fingers were still clenched on his sleeve, and I made a conscious effort to relax them, embarrassed by my desperation. "There's no need for thanks," he said, his gray eyes meeting mine again. There was no pity in them, which was the greatest relief of all. There was just a calm, unwavering attention. Sometimes a crowd can feel like an ambush. He gave my hand a slight, reassuring squeeze before he slowly withdrew his, and I finally let go of his arm. The fabric felt cool without his touch. An older woman in a glittering emerald dress approached us then, her smile bright. "Arthur, darling. We were just saying we haven't seen you all night." Arthur Vance inclined his head, a small, polite smile touching his lips. "Eleanor. I've been attending to a few details." His gaze flickered to me for a fraction of a second, a silent signal that felt both protective and proprietary. He turned back to the woman. "Forgive me. I need to borrow my associate for a moment." He placed a hand on the small of my back, a light but firm pressure that guided me away from the pillar and into a slow, deliberate path through the throng of guests. My mind was a chaotic buzz. His associate. The word hung in the air between us. He was giving me a role, a cover story, a reason to be at his side that didn't involve me being a terrified wreck. He was steering me toward a less crowded part of the room, his hand a constant, warm presence against the thin fabric of my uniform jacket. I could feel the strength in that hand, the controlled, effortless power. This was a man accustomed to being in charge, yet his guidance felt like a courtesy, not a command. We stopped near a quiet alcove overlooking the conservatory's moonlit sculpture garden. He didn't speak right away, just stood beside me, our shoulders almost touching. We watched the guests mingling below, their laughter a distant, muffled sound through the thick glass. The silence wasn't awkward. It felt intentional, like he was giving me space to breathe, to gather the frayed edges of my composure. I watched him from the corner of my eye. His profile was even more striking up close. A strong jaw, a straight nose, the fine lines around his eyes that spoke of years of quiet observation. He wasn't handsome in the way Julian was, all flash and polished surfaces. Arthur Vance's presence was something deeper, a quiet foundation that you felt more than you saw. It was the steadiness I had always craved, the calm I could never seem to find. Why was he doing this? A man like him could have had me removed from my audacity. He could have ignored me, dismissed me, shamed me. Instead, he had offered protection without a single question. I tried to decipher the motive, my brain wired for suspicion after years with Julian. Was this a game? Was I a momentary amusement, a stray he'd decided to shelter for an evening? The thought was bitter, but it was the only one that made sense in the world I knew. He finally turned his head, his gaze catching mine. "Better?" he asked. I nodded, my throat tight. "Much. Mr. Vance, I am so sorry. That was unprofessional and completely inappropriate." I panicked. "There is no need to apologize for needing a safe harbor," he said, his voice soft but firm. "And please, call me Arthur." He paused, his eyes searching my face. "You work for the catering company?" "Yes. For about a year now, my name." I should tell him my name. "I'm Leo." "Leo," he repeated, tasting the word. It sounded different coming from him, more solid. "Well, Leo, you handle yourself with a great deal of composure." Even when panicked, a short, humorless laugh escaped me. "It didn't feel like composure, nevertheless," he insisted gently. A waiter, one of my co-workers, approached with a tray of champagne flutes. Arthur took two, his movements fluid and economical. He offered one to me. I stared at it, my mind blanking. I was on duty. I couldn't drink. As if reading my thoughts, he said, "Your shift can be over. I'll speak with your manager." He held the glass out, his expression unreadable but patient. Taking it felt like crossing a line, stepping out of my prescribed role and into something new and undefined. My hand was shaking slightly as my fingers brushed against his. The brief contact sent a jolt of warmth through me. It was absurd, this reaction. It was just a glass of champagne. But it felt like more. It felt like an invitation. I took a small sip. The bubbles were sharp and cold against my tongue. We stood there for another minute, the silence stretching out again, but this time it felt different. It was charged with unspoken questions. I was intensely aware of him, of the space between us, of the subtle scent of his cologne, of the way the moonlight from the garden caught the silver in his hair. My internal monologue was a frantic loop of disbelief and cautious hope. What was happening? Who was this man who could silence my demons with a single, steadying touch? The brush of his jacket sleeve against my arm as he turned slightly was enough to make my breath catch. It was nothing, a careless movement, but in my heightened state, it felt like a deliberate act. I was analyzing everything, every glance, every pause, every minuscule shift in his posture, trying to build a map of this uncharted territory. He was a puzzle, and I was desperate to find the key. I was so used to intentions being hidden, to kindness being a currency for a later, crueler transaction. But Arthur's quiet regard felt clean, unburdened by expectation. Or maybe I was just projecting my own desperate yearning onto him. "That man," Arthur said, his voice pulling me from my thoughts. He was looking back out at the party, his expression thoughtful. "Is he a frequent problem?" He didn't need to specify who he meant. The question was direct, but his tone was gentle, devoid of morbid curiosity. It felt like a genuine inquiry into my well-being. "He was," I admitted, my voice low. "An old problem." Arthur nodded slowly, accepting my vague explanation without pressing for more. "Old problems have a nasty habit of feeling new again when they reappear." He took a sip of his champagne, his eyes still on the crowd. It was then that I noticed it, the way he was standing. He was positioned just so, his body subtly shielding me from the main floor. It was a small thing, a barely perceptible act of protection, but it felt monumental. He was still providing that safe harbor, even now that the immediate threat had passed. This quiet, continued act of care was more unsettling than any overt gesture would have been. It chipped away at my defenses, finding the cracks in the walls I had so carefully built around myself. I didn't know how to respond to it. Kindness without an agenda was a foreign language to me. He finished his champagne and set the empty flute on a passing tray. Then he turned to face me fully, his body language closing off the space to the rest of the room, creating a private world for just the two of us in that alcove. "Leo," he began, and the directness of his gaze made my stomach flutter. "I find myself in need of some short-term assistance. My personal archivist has taken an unexpected leave of absence, and my library is in a state of managed chaos. It requires someone with a meticulous eye and a quiet disposition." I stared at him, my mind struggling to keep up. Was he offering me a job? Now? Here? It seemed preposterous. He must have seen the confusion on my face, because a faint, almost imperceptible smile touched the corners of his mouth. "I have observed you at these events before. You are efficient, unobtrusive, and you notice things others miss. When you adjusted the fallen name card at table 7 earlier, you did it without breaking stride and without drawing a single eye. That is a rare skill." He had been watching me. The thought sent a dizzying wave of heat through my chest. Before tonight, I had been invisible, just part of the scenery. But he had seen me. He had noticed a detail so small I had already forgotten it myself. The position would involve organizing and cataloging a collection of my family's correspondence, he continued, his tone all business now, yet still gentle. It would be a temporary contract. 2 months, perhaps 3. The pay would be significantly better than what you make here, and the hours would be far more civilized. My head was spinning. An escape from the catering world, an escape from the constant financial anxiety that hummed beneath the surface of my life. It was a lifeline, offered by a man I had just met under the most bizarre of circumstances. My ingrained suspicion immediately kicked in. This was too good to be true. There had to be a catch. Men like Julian always had a catch. I hope this offer doesn't feel obligatory, Arthur said, his voice softening, his gaze seeming to pierce right through my cynical defenses. I saw you were in a difficult situation, but my offer is genuine and entirely professional. It is based on what I have observed of your character and your work ethic. You have a composure that is rare. He paused, letting the words settle. You are, of course, entirely free to decline. There would be no offense taken. Your decision will have no bearing on what happened tonight. There it was. That moment of softness, of vulnerability. He was acknowledging the power imbalance, the strangeness of the situation. He was giving me all the power, laying out the terms with perfect clarity and offering me an easy, consequence-free exit. He was worried about being seen as coercive, as taking advantage of my panic. And that concern, that simple, ethical consideration, was more persuasive than any sales pitch. It was an open door, not a test. It was a hand offered, palm up. I looked into his steady gray eyes and saw not a millionaire, not a powerful benefactor, but a man who valued decency. A man who saw a person in distress and offered not pity, but an opportunity. An opportunity wrapped in respect. My caution was a deeply ingrained habit, a survival mechanism honed over years. But for the first time in a very long time, my intuition was telling me to trust. I took a breath, the first truly deep one I'd taken all night. I would be very interested, Arthur, I said, my voice quiet but firm. Thank you. A look of quiet relief washed over his features, so subtle it was almost imperceptible. Good, he said simply. My assistant will contact you tomorrow to arrange the details. We can finalize the contract then. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a slim, heavy card case. He extracted a business card and handed it to me. The cardstock was thick, the lettering a simple, elegant gray emboss. Arthur Vance. Below it, a single phone number and an email address. No title, no company name. It was understated and confident. My fingers closed around the card. It felt warm from his pocket. It felt like a promise. The beginning of something I couldn't yet name. The first day at the Vance estate felt like stepping into another dimension. A long, tree-lined drive opened onto a house that was less a house and more a work of art. It was modern, all clean lines of stone and glass, but it was nestled into the landscape so perfectly that it seemed to have grown there. It was grand without being ostentatious, a physical extension of the man himself. I was met at the door by a pleasant, efficient woman named Clara, Arthur's assistant. She led me to the library, and my jaw nearly hit the floor. It was 2 stories high, with floor-to-ceiling shelves packed with books. A spiral staircase of dark ironwork led to a second-level gallery. In the center of the room, on a series of large mahogany tables, were dozens of archival boxes. My project. The managed chaos Arthur had described. He found me there about an hour later. I was carefully lifting the lid off the first box, revealing stacks of letters tied with faded silk ribbon. He didn't announce his presence, just seemed to materialize in the doorway, holding 2 mugs of coffee. He wore soft gray trousers and a dark blue cashmere sweater that made him look younger, more approachable. I thought you might need this, he said, handing me one of the mugs. The warmth seeped into my palms. Clara showed you everything? She did. It's an amazing room, I said, feeling ridiculously inadequate. It's my favorite, he admitted, his eyes scanning the shelves with a deep, quiet affection. A history of my family's arguments, ambitions, and affections, all bound in paper and ink. He gestured to the boxes. Your task is to bring some order to the affections. The arguments can stay buried, and so we began. Our days settled into a quiet, comfortable rhythm. I would arrive in the morning, and Arthur would already be in his study, the room adjacent to the library. We worked in our separate spaces, but the large double doors between the rooms were always left open. The house was silent except for the rustle of my papers, the soft click of his keyboard, and the occasional sigh of the old house settling. I became a student of his quiet competence. I would watch him from my desk, pretending to be absorbed in a letter from his great-aunt. I watched the way he would lean back in his chair, one hand rubbing his chin as he read a document, his focus absolute. I learned the sound of his footsteps on the hardwood floor, the low murmur of his voice on the phone. He was a man of intense discipline and focus, yet there was a gentleness to him that I saw in small, private moments. The way he would pause to watch a bird land on the feeder outside his window, a soft smile touching his lips. The care with which he watered the collection of orchids on his windowsill. These observations became a form of intimacy. I was learning him in a way no one else did, through the quiet details of his daily life. I learned that he drank his coffee black, that he preferred classical music in the afternoons, and that he had a faint scar just above his left eyebrow that was only visible when the light hit it a certain way. Our conversations were brief, mostly about the work. I would find a particularly interesting letter and bring it to him. He would read it, and we would talk about the ancestor who wrote it. Through their words, I was learning his history, the context that had shaped him. He, in turn, would ask about my progress, his questions always insightful, showing a genuine interest in the task he had set for me. The power imbalance was always there, a quiet hum in the background. He was my employer. This was his magnificent home. I was a temporary fixture. I never forgot that, and I was careful to maintain a professional distance. Yet, Arthur himself seemed determined to blur those lines in small, subtle ways. He insisted I join him for lunch, which was always a simple affair of soup and sandwiches served on the terrace overlooking the gardens. He would ask about my life, not in an intrusive way, but with a gentle curiosity that invited sharing. I found myself telling him things I hadn't told anyone, about growing up in a small town, about my abandoned dream of being a history teacher, about the suffocating loneliness that had followed my breakup with Julian. He listened. He never offered advice unless I asked for it. He just listened, his gray eyes full of an empathy that made me feel seen and valued. I started to look forward to those lunches, to the easy companionship that was growing between us. I was beginning to feel less like an employee and more like a guest, a welcome one. The meaningful touches were rare, and all the more potent for it. One afternoon, I was reaching for a box on a high shelf, standing on the rolling library ladder. I misjudged the distance and wobbled, a small gasp escaping my lips. In a flash, Arthur was there, his hands closing firmly around my waist to steady me. "Careful," he said, his voice a low rumble so close to my ear. My entire body went rigid. I could feel the heat of his hands through my shirt, the solid strength of his body pressed against the ladder behind me. I could smell that faint, clean scent of him. My heart was pounding. I held onto the shelf, my knuckles white. "I'm all right," I managed to say, my voice breathy. He didn't let go immediately. For a long, charged moment, his hands remained at my waist, a silent, grounding pressure. It wasn't sexual, it was protective. But the intimacy of the gesture, the sheer proximity of him, sent a shockwave through my system. When he finally stepped back, his expression was unreadable. "The top shelves can be treacherous," was all he said before turning and walking back to his study. I stood on that ladder for a full minute after he left, my legs trembling. The feel of his hands lingered, a phantom warmth at my waist. I was falling for him. It wasn't a schoolboy crush anymore, not a fantasy about a distant, powerful man. I was falling for Arthur, the man who listened, the man who cared for orchids, the man whose hands had kept me from falling. And that realization terrified me. This was my job. This was a professional relationship, and I was about to make it impossibly complicated. The following week, Arthur had to host a small dinner party for some of the Conservancy's board members. He asked me if I would be willing to stay late that evening to help him prepare, offering to pay me for the extra hours. He needed help arranging some documents he wanted to present. It was a perfectly reasonable request, but it felt like something more. It felt like he was looking for a reason to keep me there. We worked side by side at the large dining room table, collating papers and slipping them into folders. The task required cooperation, our hands occasionally brushing as we reached for the same document. Each accidental touch was a small spark, a jolt of electricity that I felt all the way to my toes. The air between us was thick with unspoken things. I was so focused on not letting my feelings show that I became clumsy, dropping a stack of papers that scattered across the polished floor. "I'm so sorry," I mumbled, my face flushing with embarrassment as I knelt to gather them. Arthur knelt beside me, his movements unhurried. "It's just paper, Leo." We gathered the sheets in silence, our heads close together. As we both reached for the last one, our fingers met. This time, it wasn't an accident. His fingers closed gently over mine, stilling my movement. I looked up, my breath catching in my throat. His face was only inches away. I could see the fine lines around his eyes, the subtle silver stubble on his jaw. His gray eyes were dark with an emotion I couldn't quite name, but it made my stomach swoop. "Leo," he said, his voice barely a whisper. The doorbell rang then, sharp and intrusive, shattering the moment. It was the first of the guests arriving. Arthur blinked, and the spell was broken. He slowly withdrew his hand and stood up, offering me a hand to help me to my feet. His grip was firm and warm. "We should finish this later," he said, his voice back to its usual calm, but I could see a muscle twitching in his jaw. The dinner was a strange kind of torture. Arthur introduced me to his guests as his archival consultant, a title that felt both grand and fraudulent. He included me in the conversation, drawing me out with questions about the historical documents I was working on. He made me feel like I belonged. But all I could think about was that moment on the floor, the feel of his fingers over mine, the look in his eyes. I saw him watching me throughout the evening, a lingering gaze over the rim of his wine glass, a quick, soft smile when my eyes met his from across the table. He was a perfect host, charming and attentive to everyone, but I felt like I was the true focus of his attention. It was exhilarating and terrifying in equal measure. After the guests had left, I helped him clear the last of the glasses from the living room. The house was quiet again, filled with the comfortable silence I had grown accustomed to. We stood by the massive fireplace, the embers glowing softly in the hearth. Arthur turned to me, his expression serious. "I need to apologize," he said, and I was so surprised I couldn't speak. "Tonight, before the guests arrived, I crossed a line. This is a professional arrangement, and my behavior was inappropriate. I put you in an uncomfortable position." He was doing it again. He was taking responsibility, trying to protect me, even from himself. He was giving me an out, a chance to pretend that moment hadn't happened, that it hadn't meant anything. And I realized I didn't want the out. "You didn't," I said, my voice stronger than I expected. It wasn't uncomfortable. A long silence stretched between us. The only sound was the soft crackle of the dying fire. Arthur watched me, his face a mask of careful neutrality, but his eyes were searching mine, looking for something. "Permission, maybe." "I value your presence here, Leo," he said slowly, choosing his words with immense care. "More than I should, perhaps. I am aware of my position, of my age, of the circumstances that brought you here. The last thing I would ever want is for you to feel pressured or obligated in any way." It was the most honest, vulnerable thing anyone had ever said to me. He was laying all his cards on the table, naming the elephants in the room, the age gap, the wealth disparity, the employer-employee dynamic. He was showing me the deepest respect by trusting me with his own vulnerability. My fear, my caution, all the walls I had built, they just crumbled. In their place was a clarity so profound it felt like a revelation. This wasn't Julian. This wasn't a game. This was real. I took a step closer to him, closing half the distance between us. My heart was hammering, but for the first time, it wasn't from fear. It was from hope. "Arthur," I said, my voice soft. "What if I don't feel pressured? What if I feel safe?" I took another step. We were so close now I could feel the warmth radiating from his body. "What if I told you that when you steadied me on that ladder, it was the first time in years I hadn't felt like I was about to fall?" I see it now. This is the tipping point. The moment where silence becomes impossible. The external pressure was the dinner party, the need to define my role for others. But the real catalyst is internal. It's this quiet, late-night confrontation, born of his sense of ethics. His carefully composed expression finally broke. A wave of raw emotion passed through his eyes, relief, hope, and a deep, soul-shaking tenderness that stole my breath. He lifted a hand, as if to touch my face, but then hesitated, his fingers hovering in the air between us. It was a question, and I answered it. I closed the last inch of space, leaning into his touch, letting my cheek rest against his palm. His skin was warm, his fingers slightly rough against my face. It was the most exquisitely gentle touch I had ever known. A sigh escaped him, a sound of profound release. "Leo," he breathed, his thumb stroking my cheekbone. His other hand came up to cup the other side of my face, holding me as if I were something precious. His gray eyes searched mine, and in their depths, I saw everything he hadn't said. The loneliness, the yearning, the quiet hope that I might feel the same. "I don't just feel safe with you," I whispered, the confession tumbling out, raw and honest. "I feel more." That was all it took. The last barrier dissolved. He leaned in slowly, giving me every chance to pull away, to change my mind. I didn't. I met him halfway. His lips were softer than I had imagined, and the kiss was nothing like the desperate, hungry kisses I had known before. This was a kiss of profound relief, of arrival. It was unhurried, a quiet conversation of texture and warmth. It spoke of patience, of tenderness, of a feeling that had been held in check for far too long. It tasted of expensive wine and quiet certainty. It felt like coming home. When we finally broke apart, he didn't move away. He rested his forehead against mine, our breath mingling in the quiet air. I could feel the steady beat of his heart through the front of his sweater. His hands were still cradling my face, his thumbs gently stroking my skin. "More," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "I feel more, too." We stood there for a long time, wrapped in the quiet intimacy of the moment, the fire casting a warm, flickering glow around us. It wasn't a dizzying, passionate explosion. It was better. It was a quiet foundation settling into place, solid and sure. It was the opening of a long-locked door. It was right. It was unforced. It was, quite simply, everything. I woke the next morning in one of the guest suites, the morning sun streaming through the tall windows. The sheets were impossibly soft, the silence of the house a gentle blanket. For a moment, I felt a sense of perfect peace. Then, reality flooded in, cold and sharp. What had I done? I had kissed my boss. I had spent the night in his house, chastely, in a separate room after that one. Perfect kiss, but I had stayed. I sat up in bed, the silk comforter pooling around my waist, and the old anxieties came rushing back. The sheer scale of the room, the priceless art on the walls, the view of the sprawling, manicured grounds, it all screamed of a world I didn't belong to. I was Leo, the cater waiter, the guy with a mountain of student debt and an apartment the size of Arthur's walk-in closet. He was Arthur Vance. The power dynamic hadn't vanished with a kiss. It had become infinitely more complicated. What would people say? I could already hear Julian's sneering voice in my head, calling me a gold digger. The thought made my stomach clench with shame. I was terrified of losing my independence, of becoming a kept thing, a footnote in the life of a wealthy man. I dressed quickly in the clothes I'd worn the night before, my hands feeling clumsy and slow. I needed to leave, to get back to my own small, safe space where I could think. I crept out of the room, my shoes in my hand, feeling like a thief. The house was silent. I made it to the grand foyer, my hand on the heavy front door, when his voice stopped me. "Leo." I turned. Arthur was standing at the entrance to the kitchen, dressed in a simple t-shirt and jeans, which was somehow more disarming than his expensive suits. He was holding a mug, and his hair was slightly rumpled from sleep. He looked tired and a little worried. The sight of his concern made my own anxieties feel selfish. "I was just leaving," I said, my voice sounding strained to my own ears. I have things to do." He didn't move closer, respecting my space. But his eyes were full of a gentle understanding. "I made coffee," he said simply. "Please, don't run away." His perceptiveness was unnerving. He saw right through me, to the fear I was trying so hard to hide. I hesitated, my hand still on the doorknob. Leaving felt like the safe option, the way to protect myself. But it also felt like cowardice. It felt like letting Julian win, letting the past dictate my future. Slowly, I let go of the door and walked toward him. The kitchen was a beautiful, functional space, flooded with morning light. It was the heart of the house, and it felt surprisingly normal, lived in. He poured me a mug of coffee without asking how I took it. He already knew. We sat at a small wooden table in a breakfast nook that overlooked the gardens. For a few minutes, we just sat in silence, sipping our coffee, the morning quiet settling around us. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and steady. You're worried, he said. It wasn't a question. I looked down at my hands wrapped around the warm mug. This is a lot, I admitted. You and me, this house, last night. I don't know what this is, Arthur. And I'm scared of what it looks like. What it looks like to whom? He asked gently. To the world? Or to you? Both, I whispered. I've spent the last 2 years fighting to stand on my own 2 feet. I can't. I don't want to be dependent on anyone. I don't want to be seen as someone who is with you for your money. He reached across the table and covered my hand with his. His touch was warm and reassuring. Leo, look at me. I lifted my gaze to meet his. Your independence is one of the things I admire most about you. I would never do anything to compromise that. Last night was not about this house or my money. It was about you and me. Nothing else. He gave my hand a squeeze. Our work contract remains in place. It is separate from this. Your salary will continue to be managed by Clara through my company. Your work is your own. Your money is your own. This, he said, gesturing around the kitchen, is my home. And I hope, in time, you will feel it can be a home for you too. But that is a choice, not an obligation. We will navigate this together at your pace. I promise. He wasn't dismissing my fears. He was validating them, and then methodically, practically, dismantling them. He was offering reassurance not just with words, but with a concrete plan that protected my autonomy. The knot of anxiety in my stomach began to loosen. He understood. He truly understood. Tears pricked my eyes, and I blinked them back, feeling overwhelmed with a gratitude so immense it almost hurt. Okay, I said, my voice thick. Okay. A few weeks later, we faced our first real test. Arthur was being honored at a small, private luncheon for his philanthropic work. It wasn't a huge gala like the one where we'd met, but a more intimate gathering of about 30 people, his close friends and professional associates. He asked me to come with him as his partner. The entire morning leading up to it, I was a wreck. I changed my outfit 3 times, convinced everything I owned looked cheap and out of place. This was the first time we would be seen together, publicly, as a couple. I was terrified of the looks, the whispered questions, the judgment. My old insecurities were roaring back to life. Arthur found me staring at my reflection, tugging at the collar of my shirt. He came up behind me and wrapped his arms around my waist, resting his chin on my shoulder. We looked at our reflection together in the mirror. You look perfect, he said softly, his voice a warm rumble against my back. I feel like an imposter, I confessed. He tightened his arms around me. You are the most real person I know, he said. Just stay close to me. We'll face the firing squad together. His attempt at a joke was gentle, and it made me smile. When we walked into the private dining room, a hush fell over the conversations. I felt a dozen pairs of eyes land on us, on Arthur's hand resting lightly on the small of my back. It was exactly as I had feared. For a second, I wanted to bolt, but then I felt the steady, reassuring pressure of Arthur's hand. I took a deep breath and looked up. Arthur steered us toward an older couple, his smile warm and genuine. Charles, Martha, I'm so glad you could make it. He turned to me, his hand never leaving my back. I'd like you to meet my partner, Leo. He didn't hesitate. He didn't use a vague term like friend or associate. He said, partner, his voice full of quiet pride. The words settled over me like a warm blanket. The couple, Charles and Martha, smiled, their eyes kind. They shook my hand and immediately started asking me about the archival project, a topic Arthur had clearly briefed them on. Throughout the lunch, he was my anchor. He kept me included, drew me into stories, and touched me often, a hand on my arm, his knee brushing mine under the table. They were small, possessive gestures of affection and support. He was showing his world, in his own quiet way, that I was with him, that I was important. And I saw his friends responding not with judgment, but with warmth and acceptance. They were taking their cue from him, and his cue was one of unwavering respect for me. By the end of the meal, I was breathing easier. The fear had receded, replaced by a deep, glowing warmth. We had navigated it together. He hadn't hidden me. He had presented me, proudly. The ghost of Julian's sneer finally, truly, began to fade. A few days after the luncheon, we were having a quiet evening at the house. I had finished my work for the day, and we were sitting on the terrace, watching the sun set, a comfortable silence between us. My contract was due to end in a few weeks, and the unspoken question of what came next hung in the air. I decided to be brave. My project is almost done, I said, looking out at the sky, which was painted in shades of orange and pink. Arthur was quiet for a moment. I know, he finally said. He turned to look at me, his expression serious. I have a proposal. My heart did a little flip. It's not another job, he said quickly, as if reading my mind. It's a conscious choice. I want you in my life, Leo. Not as my archivist, not as a temporary guest. As my partner. In every sense of the word. He paused, taking a breath. But I also want you to have your own life, your own space. I was thinking, perhaps you keep your apartment as a place that is yours. And this house, he gestured to the grand structure behind us, can be ours. You can stay here whenever you want, for as long as you want. We can take this one step at a time, build our own rules. No pressure, no expectations. Just us. It was the most thoughtful, respectful proposition I could have imagined. He wasn't asking me to move in, to give up my sanctuary. He was suggesting a way for us to merge our lives without me losing myself. He was honoring the independence he knew I cherished. It was a practical next step, grounded in the reality of our different lives, but aimed at building a shared future. I'd like that, I said, my voice soft. I'd like that very much, he smiled, a real, unguarded smile that lit up his entire face. He reached for my hand, his fingers lacing with mine. We sat there, hand in hand, and watched the last sliver of sun dip below the horizon. We had made a conscious choice. We were proceeding with care and steadiness, building our relationship on a foundation of mutual respect and clearly defined boundaries. The next morning, I woke up in Arthur's bed. Sometime during the night, I had migrated from my guest suite. It had felt natural, inevitable. I woke to the smell of coffee brewing. I pulled on a shirt and padded into the kitchen to find Arthur standing at the stove, making pancakes. The morning sun filled the room, glinting off the stainless steel appliances. He looked up as I entered and smiled, that soft, private smile that was just for me. Morning, he said. Hungry. I came and stood beside him, leaning against the counter. The kitchen, which had once felt so intimidating, now felt like the warmest, safest place on earth. I watched his capable hands as he expertly flipped a pancake. We moved around each other with an easy, comfortable familiarity, a quiet domestic ballet. It wasn't a grand, sweeping romance. It was something better. It was real. It was two people, making breakfast together, the promise of a new day stretching out before them. This quiet intimacy felt like an arrival, a destination I never knew I was searching for. I stood there, watching him, a profound sense of peace settling deep in my bones. I thought back to the man I was just a few months ago, the anxious, isolated server, hiding in the shadows, terrified of his own past. And I looked at the man I was now, standing in the sunlit kitchen of the man I loved, feeling steady and seen and cherished. The differences in our ages, in our bank accounts, they hadn't vanished. They had simply become part of the landscape of our lives, context rather than a cage. Arthur's wealth hadn't bought my affection. It had, through his own decency and care, given us the safe space we needed for it to grow. He had used his power not to control, but to protect. He had used his resources not to possess, but to provide sanctuary. And in that sanctuary, I had found not just a partner, but myself. I was no longer afraid. I was home. Share your thoughts in the comments. What moment stayed with you? If the story resonated, a like helps others find it. Subscribe for more slow burn male/male love stories told with warmth and care.